The beaches of Normandy were not quiet on that fateful June morning in 1944. The roar of artillery, the crack of machine guns, and the cries of soldiers filled the air as waves of young men from America, Britain, and Canada fought to carve out a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe. But behind the chaos of battle, behind the clash of steel and the blood in the surf, lay a question that would decide the fate of the war itself. Could the Allies not only storm ashore, but stay there? Could they sustain an invasion of continental Europe? Not for a day or a week, but for months, even years, until the Nazi war machine was crushed once and for all? German commanders scoffed at the idea. To them, the Americans were amateurs. They saw a nation with no thousand-year military tradition, no vast empire of colonies feeding its armies. They believed the United States might produce plenty of trucks, tanks, and airplanes, but when it came to the grinding test of sustaining an army in the field, they were certain the Americans would collapse. After all, Napoleon had once marched into Russia with 500,000 men and lost them to hunger, cold, and supply failures. Hitler himself had seen the same disaster unfold on the Eastern Front. In German eyes, the Americans would drown not in blood, but in their own logistics. But they were wrong. What the German generals could not imagine was the sheer industrial muscle and logistical genius the United States was about to unleash. They underestimated not just the size of American factories, but the audacity of American supply planners. In 1944, the United States had become the greatest arsenal and supplier of armies in history, capable of feeding, fueling, and arming millions of men thousands of miles from home. While German soldiers were surviving on black bread and horse meat, American GIs landing in Normandy were eating steak, eggs, and fresh bread delivered straight from ships anchored just offshore. It was more than comfort. It was power. An army that eats well, marches well, and fights well. But to understand how America pulled off this miracle, we must go back before the landings, before the first Higgins boat hit the beach, before Europe trembled under the Allied onslaught. We must return to the beginning of the war, when the United States was still untested, still underestimated, and when the idea of sending millions of men across an ocean seemed nearly impossible. In 1939, when war broke out in Europe, the U.S. Army was smaller than that of Portugal. Its supply system was outdated, its equipment limited, and its military planners had no experience sustaining operations on a global scale. The Germans, by contrast, had already proven their ability to conquer and occupy vast territories, driving deep into Poland, Norway, France, and eventually the Soviet Union. They believed speed, aggression, and bold strikes, what they called blitzkrieg, could outpace any logistical strain. Supplies would follow victory, they thought. Victory first, details later. But that philosophy carried a dangerous flaw. Germany's conquest spread its supply lines thin. By 1941, in the frozen snows of Russia, German divisions were starving and stalling. Tanks ran dry of fuel. Horses pulled wagons in place of trucks. German soldiers scrounged for food in peasant villages. The Wehrmacht had skill, courage, and experience, but it lacked one thing, a reliable supply chain. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning a different lesson. Though they entered the war late, they did so with a unique advantage. America was not fighting with its back to the wall. Its homeland was untouched, its factories humming, its fields producing food in staggering abundance. It had access to oceans, oil, steel, and manpower on a scale no Axis power could hope to match. The challenge was not production. It was movement. How could America transport this avalanche of material across thousands of miles of ocean, land it on hostile shores, and move it inland fast enough to keep the momentum of war alive? This was the riddle that consumed Allied planners as they prepared for the greatest amphibious invasion in history. For months before D-Day, warehouses across England filled with crates of food, mountains of ammunition, and endless stacks of jerrycans filled with gasoline. Engineers designed artificial harbors, floating roads, and pipelines that could deliver supplies straight onto French beaches. And yet, even with all this preparation, doubts lingered. Would the beaches be secure enough to unload ships? Would storms sweep away the artificial harbors? Would German bombers sink the supply fleet before it could reach shore? To sustain the invasion, the Allies would need not just courage on the battlefield, but precision behind it. Every bullet fired, every tank that advanced, Every jeep that rolled forward depended on an invisible army of supply officers, engineers, truck drivers, and quartermasters working in perfect synchronization. The Germans never believed it possible. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt dismissed the Americans as a nation of mechanics who lacked the discipline of true soldiers. General Erwin Rommel, though more cautious, still doubted the Allies could push supplies inland faster than German counterattacks could bleed them dry. The German General Staff had seen supply chains collapse before. Why should this be any different? But the Americans were about to prove them wrong in the most dramatic way imaginable. Imagine the scene, the beaches of Normandy, just days after D-Day. The sand is still littered with wreckage, burned-out tanks, twisted metal. The bodies have fallen. And yet, already, something extraordinary is happening. Ship after ship anchors offshore, lowering ramps, spilling out trucks, crates, and bulldozers. Engineers are constructing makeshift roads across the sand, while cranes swing into motion, hoisting tons of supplies onto waiting vehicles. Bulldozers flatten rubble into pathways. A floating harbor, assembled piece by piece like a giant puzzle, is taking shape, allowing cargo ships to unload directly onto French soil. And among the chaos, the sight that shock-captured German soldiers most, American GIs sitting in the grass, eating hot meals. Fresh meat, canned fruit, even coffee brewed on the spot. To German eyes, it was unthinkable. Their own armies in France were living off whatever they could requisition, often short on rations. But the Americans? They were fighting with full stomachs, driving tanks that never ran dry, and carrying weapons with ammunition in endless supply. It wasn't just comfort. It was an unstoppable advantage. As one German officer later confessed, "We did not understand until too late. The Americans could replace everything, men, machines, even entire armies. They had more of everything than we could ever imagine." And so, while the Germans sneered at the idea of American logistics, the reality was dawning all across Normandy. This invasion would not falter for lack of supplies. Instead, it would roll forward with momentum powered not just by bravery, but by crates of food, tanks of gasoline, and the relentless machinery of the American supply chain. But how, exactly, did America achieve this miracle of logistics? What strategies, inventions, and sheer ingenuity made it possible to feed, fuel, and arm millions of men across an ocean while fighting some of the toughest battles in history? That is the story of the American supply chain in World War II, a story that turned German laughter into stunned disbelief, and one that would ultimately decide the fate of Europe. The Germans believed they understood war better than anyone. They had mastered the art of fast strikes, of tanks and planes working in harmony, of generals who made bold moves across the chessboard of Europe. But what they never fully grasped was that in the 20th century, victory belonged not only to the generals who planned battles, but to the planners who moved beans, bullets, and gasoline. And in 1944, no one in the world mastered that better than the Americans. In the weeks after D-Day, the beaches of Normandy became a living, breathing machine. They were not just battlefields. They were arteries pumping life into the invasion. At dawn, ships stood offshore in endless rows, stretching the horizon, each one stuffed with supplies. Barges ferried cargo ashore, while cranes lifted crates of ammunition, jeeps, even prefabricated bridges ready to be assembled. Bulldozers churned the sand into roads, while soldiers stacked boxes of food in neat pyramids. And at night, when the gunfire died down, you could see the glow of headlights as convoys rolled inland, carrying the fuel and rations that made the Allied advance possible. Every single day, the Americans landed thousands of tons of cargo: ammunition, medical supplies, radios, uniforms, and perhaps most importantly, food. The American Army believed in feeding its soldiers well, and this was no accident. Commanders knew that an army that marched on a full stomach had strength, stamina, and morale. The standard American ration contained meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, even cigarettes. By contrast, many German soldiers were reduced to eating thin slices of black bread, watery soup, or whatever they could forage from the countryside. The difference was not just one of comfort. It was psychological. American GIs felt cared for, supplied, and ready. German troops, by comparison, often felt abandoned by their own logistics. But the real marvel was not just what came ashore. It was how it moved inland. The Americans had a simple but powerful philosophy: never stop the flow. Supplies were not hoarded, not stockpiled in massive warehouses where they might become bottlenecked. Instead, they were constantly in motion. If a crate of ammunition was unloaded in the morning, it was already on a truck by afternoon and at the front line by evening. The system worked like a river, always flowing, always replenishing, never standing still long enough to be choked off. One of the great symbols of the supply miracle was the Red Ball Express. It began in August 1944, when the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and raced across France. The problem was fuel. The tanks of General Patton's Third Army roared forward so quickly that they risked outrunning their supply lines. Without gasoline, the advance would grind to a halt. So the Americans improvised. They created a massive convoy system, known as the Red Ball Express, made up of thousands of trucks painted with a red ball insignia. These trucks drove day and night, under strict orders. No stopping, no detours, no hesitation. They thundered down special roads reserved just for them, carrying drums of gasoline, food, and ammunition to the front. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were often African-American soldiers, many of whom had been assigned to support units due to segregation policies. They faced grueling hours, poor conditions, and constant danger from German air attacks. Yet they delivered. Day after day, they kept the fuel flowing, ensuring that Patton's tanks never ran dry. Without them, the dash across France would have ended in disaster. With them, it became one of the fastest and most relentless advances in modern military history. To the Germans, this seemed impossible. How could the Americans, so far from home, keep their armies fed and fuel with such speed? The answer lay in organization and scale. American factories churned out not only weapons, but the trucks to carry them, the spare parts to repair them, and even the packaging to protect them. Cans of gasoline were standardized to fit perfectly into trucks and stacks. Food was packed in durable, waterproof crates. Even chocolate was designed into a special deration bar that would not melt in heat. Nothing was left to chance. But the ingenuity went further still. In the months after D-Day, Allied engineers laid down something extraordinary, a pipeline under the ocean. It was called Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. Stretching from England to France, it carried fuel directly beneath the waves, hidden from German submarines. With Pluto, the Allies could pump gasoline straight from storage tanks in Britain to the advancing armies in Europe, bypassing the dangers of tanker ships and convoys. It was a feat of engineering that seemed almost science fiction at the time. Then there were the Mulberry Harbors, massive artificial ports built in secrecy, towed across the Channel, and sunk into place off the Normandy coast. These floating harbors allowed the Allies to unload cargo ships directly onto French soil, bypassing the need for a captured port. Those storms destroyed one of the harbors shortly after D-Day. The other remained operational for months, handling millions of tons of supplies. Without it, the invasion might have starved before it ever broke out of the beachhead. All of this, the convoys, the harbors, the pipelines, was part of a grander vision. The Americans understood that wars were not won only with courage or weapons, but with movement. A tank without fuel was just a steel coffin. A soldier without food was just a body waiting to collapse. But an army with endless supply could grind forward relentlessly, wearing down even the strongest enemy. German officers who were captured during this period often expressed amazement at what they had seen. Some admitted that they had never believed such an operation could be sustained. They had expected the Americans to collapse under the sheer weight of moving millions of tons of material across an ocean. Instead, they watched in disbelief as American armies seemed to grow stronger the further they advanced. And yet, it was not perfect. For all their brilliance, the American supply chains faced constant challenges. Roads clogged with traffic, bridges destroyed by retreating Germans, whether that turned dirt tracks into rivers of mud. There were moments when fuel ran low, when trucks broke down, when commanders at the front fumed about delays. The infamous September pause in 1944, when the Allied advance slowed to a crawl, was due in large part to fuel shortages. The Red Ball Express, as powerful as it was, simply could not carry enough gasoline fast enough to keep every army on the move. But even in failure, the scale was staggering. A shortage in American terms often meant armies receiving 80% of what they needed, rather than collapsing entirely. For the Germans, such abundance was unthinkable. Their shortages meant divisions left immobile, tanks abandoned, soldiers scrounging for scraps. The contrast was night and day. And so, as the Allied armies pushed across France, through Belgium, and toward the German border, the truth became undeniable. The Americans had turned logistics into a weapon as powerful as any bomb or bullet. It was not glorious, not dramatic, not the stuff of legend sung around campfires. But it was relentless. And relentless was exactly what the Allies needed to crush the Nazi war machine once and for all. The stage was set for the final act of the war in Europe. Ahead lay the battles of the Ardennes, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final drive into the heart of Germany. And behind it all, the supply chains would continue to grind forward, unstoppable, unbreakable, and decisive. But the question remained, could this machine withstand the greatest test yet, the German counteroffensive in the bitter winter of 1944, when the enemy would throw everything they had left into one desperate gamble? Winter came to Europe like a clenched fist. By December 1944, the Allies had pushed deep into France and Belgium, their supply lines stretching like taut wires across the landscape. The Red Ball Express thundered day and night. Pluto pumped its lifeblood beneath the seas, and warehouses in liberated towns filled with mountains of crates. To many, it seemed the end of the war was near. Germany was retreating, exhausted, battered, its cities bombed to rubble. But Hitler had one last gamble. In the dense forest of the Ardennes, he prepared a desperate counterattack designed to split the Allied armies, drive them back to the coast, and force a negotiated peace. It became known as the Battle of the Bulge. On a freezing December morning, German tanks burst through the snow, their engines growling like beasts in the mist. Panzer divisions surged forward, smashing into thinly held American lines. Entire units were overrun, towns fell, and the front bulged outward under the sheer force of the attack. For a moment, it seemed as if history might repeat itself, that the Allies, like Napoleon and others before them, would falter in the face of stretched supply lines and an enemy who knew the terrain. American soldiers fought in brutal conditions. Snow fell thick, choking roads and freezing fuel lines. Men shivered in foxholes, their breath turning to ice. Ammunition ran low, fuel was scarce, and rations were thin. For days, the outcome hung in the balance. And yet, the same system that had carried the Allies across Normandy and France now swung into action with desperate urgency. Convoys rerouted through treacherous, icy roads, trucks driving with blackout lights to avoid German aircraft. Supplies poured toward the front, not in comfort, but in survival mode. Gasoline became so precious that every drum, every drop, was guarded like gold. Fuel dumps were relocated in the dead of night to keep them from falling into German hands. At one point, American engineers even siphoned gasoline directly from the tanks of parked vehicles, transferring it into jerrycans for frontline armor that needed it most. And then there was the air. As soon as the weather cleared, the skies filled with Allied planes dropping food, ammunition, and medical supplies to encircled units like those at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne held the line against overwhelming odds. The supply drops were risky, vulnerable to enemy fire and winter storms, but they made a difference between starvation and endurance. The Germans had gambled on the idea that the Americans' lifeline would snap under pressure. Instead, it bent, stretched, and then roared back with a fury. The Battle of the Bulge was a test not just of courage, but of logistics. German tanks ran out of fuel, their mighty panzers abandoned in the snow, useless hulks stranded in white fields. Soldiers scrounged for food, shivering and desperate, their offensive slowing as supplies dwindled. By contrast, the Americans, though battered and cold, found ways to keep the flow alive. Trucks continued to rumble, planes continued to fly, and eventually the tide turned. When the Ardennes forests fell silent again, the Germans had spent their last strength. Their armies were broken, their reserves gone, their hopes of victory extinguished. The Americans had proven something extraordinary. Even in the worst conditions, on a surprise attack, across an ocean, and in the dead of winter, their supply chains did not collapse. From that moment on, the end was inevitable. As the Allies crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany, the same logistical machine carried them forward. Bridges were thrown across rivers in a matter of days. Entire divisions fueled and fed like clockwork. Where German units collapsed for lack of bread or fuel, American units rolled forward with fresh supplies. The difference was stark, undeniable, and final. For the Germans, the lesson was bitter. Generals who had once mocked the Americans for their mechanical approach to war were forced to admit the truth. They had underestimated not just American industry, but the will to turn that industry into a weapon of movement, precision, and endurance. They had laughed at the thought of feeding an army across an ocean. But America had done it, and more. They had not only fed their own armies, but supplied Britain, supported the Soviets with convoys of food and weapons, and armed resistance movements across Europe. It was a scale of generosity and power the world had never seen. One captured German general summed it up in a single phrase: "The Allies fought with divisions. We fought with leftovers." But for the soldiers on the ground, it was simpler than grand strategy. For them, the supply chain meant survival. It meant a hot cup of coffee after days in the mud. It meant dry socks, fresh ammunition, a warm coat against a bitter cold. It meant tanks that did not stall for lack of fuel, rifles that never ran out of bullets, and the knowledge that somewhere behind them, unseen but tireless, an army of workers, drivers, engineers, and planners had their backs. This was a hidden army of World War II, the quartermasters who tracked every crate, the mechanics who kept every truck running, the sailors who risked U-boats to carry cargo across the Atlantic, the dock workers who unloaded ships in the rain and fog. They were not celebrated in newsreels or parades. They did not storm bunkers or raise flags. But without them, none of it, the landings, the breakthroughs, the victories, would have been possible. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the truth was clear. The war had been won not only on the beaches of Normandy or the ruins of Berlin, but in the convoys of the Atlantic, the port of England, the muddy roads of France, and the endless flow of supplies that never stopped moving forward. The German commanders had scoffed. They had believed the Americans would drown in their own logistics. But instead, those logistics became the very tide that swept them away. And in the end, perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the war, that courage wins battles, but supply chains win wars. The United States had fed an army fresh off the beaches and carried it all the way to victory. The world had seen a new kind of power, one built not only on firepower, but on the unglamorous, relentless strength of organization. It was a lesson that shaped the rest of the 20th century, as America emerged not just as a liberator, but as a logistical giant of the modern age. And for the men who sat in Normandy fields in 1944, eating hot meals while enemy prisoners watched in disbelief, the message was simple: the Germans were wrong. America could fight, America could supply, and America would not stop until the war was won.